So today we're going to be talking about addressing barriers to success for Black women in higher education. So you can think about this talk as applying to Black women in higher education broadly, but these issues that I'm going to talk about today are even more so exacerbated for Black women in STEM, right? So that is, more of a focus as well. So I'm just going to give you all an outline of the talk. So like I said, I'm going to first start by highlighting some of the barriers to success for Black women in higher education, and then kind of focus a little bit more on some issues that Black women experience, such as microaggressions, imposter syndrome, and of course, underrepresentation. And then we'll talk about what institutions of higher education can do to alleviate these issues, and what Black women themselves can do to take care of themselves while navigating these environments. So obviously we know that historically, academia and higher education has been a white male-dominated space. That means that mostly white men have been in positions of power. Obviously there was a time when women couldn't even attend institutions of higher education. And we've come a long way from that, but it's still a white male dominated space. And because of this, women and women of color especially are often presumed to not belong in these spaces or to be unqualified in their field. There's actually a book called Presumed Incompetent, which is by one of the authors cited here, Muse et al., that highlights these issues where women of color tell their stories about navigating academia and being presumed incompetent. And then so as a result of this, institutions of higher education may feel like hostile environments for women of color. They encounter a lot of barriers. Like I said, we're going to talk a little bit more about those this evening. So the first one I kind of want to focus on is microaggressions. This is a term that we hear a lot. It's kind of become part of our popular discourse, and it's defined as brief, everyday interactions that denigrate people from marginalized groups. So this can be someone of any marginalized group. It started out that microaggressions research focused primarily on race. It has expanded. But we know that for women of color and Black women in particular, there's this intersection of gender and race that is really important for us to look at. And so that's why sometimes you might hear people say that women of color occupy this double minority status because they're women and they're also in a racially minoritized group. And so there's three different types of microaggressions. The first one is micro insults. And this is remarks such as when a white person comments that a person of color is quote unquote so articulate. So a lot of times these comments can be subtle. They're not always very overt. So sometimes it's really hard to know what a microaggression is. And it's also hard to sometimes distinguish a microaggression and a macroaggression, right? That gets a little blurry. Another type is micro-invalidation. This is when a person of colors or a marginalized person's experiences, emotions, or beliefs are minimized. This is when people say things like, I don't see color. Oftentimes when people say this, they mean well, and they want people to understand that they're not racist or whatever, but it also means that they don't see the experiences of the people of whatever group of people, right? They're not understanding what it means to navigate the world as a person of color. And so this can also mean minimizing a person's feelings in the way of saying things like, well, you're just too sensitive. Some people refer to that as gaslighting, but in this instance, maybe when a person of color brings up something that happened to them or something like that. And then there's micro assaults. So this is intentionally hurtful actions, such as posting a racially insensitive poster where students of color congregate. So a lot of times well, you may have heard of like a swastika being drawn somewhere or something like that. That in a lot of ways is not, I would argue, is not a microaggression, is more of a macroaggression, but it's definitely intentionally hurtful. And of course, those who attend PWIs experience microaggressions often at greater rates. And this can have adverse effects on their mental health. So college and graduate students of color often report experiencing microaggressions and it having adverse effects on their mental health. So I kind of want to make this a little bit interactive. I was wondering if you all could think of any examples of microaggressions. They don't have to be things that you've experienced, but maybe things that you've heard or seen. I'm just curious what types of examples you all might have of microaggressions. I'm going to stop sharing for a second. Can anyone think of any examples? Okay, Nicola?
Yeah, I can think of one that I've experienced several times when I've been in a room with usually older white male professors who introduce everyone as Dr. This, Dr. This, Dr. This, and Nikki.
Yeah, that's definitely one. And that's it's one where, like, if you were to bring it up to someone, they might be like, oh, that's not really a big deal, or I didn't mean to, but it's the consequences of it, right? It has great consequences. Yeah, thank you for sharing. Anyone else?
Yeah, I would say that I've also experienced a similar microaggression. I wasn't a doctor yet, but I was included in an email chain. It was actually when I was a NSBE leader, and the national chair, who's the highest ranking officer, was referred to as Dr. Nelson, and then everyone else who were women on the thread was Miss. And at the time, while the Mr. Nelson was in a doctoral program, he's actually had just started it. So I was further along in my doctoral program than he was. So there was a little bit of irony in that. And then I had responded to the email. I said, you know, I'd answered their questions, but I also just kind of wanted to point it out to them that either we're all doctors or no one are doctors when you don't know people's status,
Right.
because then you sort of, as a woman, you didn't know that I too was in a doctoral program and dismissed that fact. And it was funny because then they responded that they too were a woman in STEM, and essentially their unconscious bias had came through in that email and they didn't even realize it until it was pointed out.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I've experienced this in a different context where students will automatically call me Miss, as opposed to doctor. And I always wonder, like, if I were one of their male professors, would they refer to me as doctor automatically? You know, I just kind of wonder. John said, my best friend is a Black man who likes nerdy things and has been told multiple times by his friends that they don't think of him as Black. Yeah, that's another big one that a lot of Black people, especially those of us who are like the only Black person navigating, or one of a few Black people navigating white spaces, will often experience. And I definitely experienced that throughout my life. So thank you all for sharing. So often with microaggressions for women of color, these are the result of stereotypes, or what Patricia Hill Collins referred to as controlling images. And these are stereotypes about Black women that are essentially used to justify their oppression. And so at predominantly white institutions, or PWIs, Black women have often been expected to embody the Jezebel stereotype, which is the stereotype of a hypersexual Black woman, or the angry Black woman stereotype, which is whenever Black women assert themselves, whether or not, you know, there's using an angry tone of voice, you know, they're assumed to embody this angry Black woman. And you all may have seen examples of this in popular figures like Michelle Obama, Joy Reid on MSNBC. Anytime Black women assert themselves or have a strong stance on something, it's seen as being the angry Black woman. And this is a way to kind of keep Black women in their place, quote unquote, and often it prevents them from speaking up because they don't want to be seen this way. Also, Black women have reported feeling sexualized and exoticized by men in educational, professional, and social settings, and feeling pressure to suppress aspects of their personality. So that goes back to this Jezebel stereotype and also the angry Black woman. And then also Black women sometimes feel silenced, marginalized, and invisible in educational, professional, and social settings. I know at my institution, I'm one of 2 or 3 Black women. Maybe one of them is biracial, but she identifies as Black. And this year we have a visiting Black woman, a visiting assistant professor. But other than that, it's just me. And when you talk about tenure track, there's only 2 of us. And so it can feel very isolating. You definitely don't want to be, or I definitely don't want to be the Black woman at the meeting that's called the angry Black woman. At the same time, I will assert myself. And then, like I mentioned earlier, for Black women in STEM, these experiences may be heightened because when we talk about STEM fields, we're talking about fields where women in general are greatly underrepresented. So then if you add being Black or being a member of a racial minority group, then that exacerbates it even more. And then another major issue that Black women deal with and women of color in general is imposter syndrome. This is defined as an inability to attribute one's own accomplishments to their aptitude, but instead attribute them to external factors such as luck and chance. And researchers have characterized imposter syndrome as feeling like a fraud, maybe thinking that you really don't belong where you are, somehow it's a mistake that you got there, or again, it's luck or chance, or maybe you were the diversity hire or something like that. They just needed a woman of color, and so that's how you got the job. And people will think that anyway, sometimes. But it's really minimizing your own abilities and kind of just, like I said, feeling like a fraud. And I know that I experience imposter syndrome. So the microaggressions that I just mentioned definitely contribute to these feelings of imposter syndrome for women of color. So like I said, this is especially common among women and Black and Indigenous people of color. And then of course, being at a PWI may exacerbate these feelings of ineptitude. And then there's the issue of underrepresentation. So we know that Black women are underrepresented among tenured faculty in institutions of higher education. So I was interested in doing some research in where we are today in terms of this representation. So I found some data. These were both of these statistics were from articles in Inside Higher Ed. And I found that in 2019, out of 89% of the colleges represented in the US Department of Education's integrated post-secondary education data system, Black women comprise less than 5% of faculty with tenure. And then Black people make up less than 8% of university administrators, according to 2020 data from the College and University Professional Association for Human Resources. So oftentimes when people don't see themselves represented in a space, and this can be the case for college students who don't see people like them represented in their professors or faculty or staff. This can be the case for tenured and tenure track faculty who don't see themselves represented in the faculty or higher or administration. It makes it more difficult to imagine yourself achieving those things. And it can exacerbate those feelings of imposter syndrome. So then we can think about what institutions of higher education can do to alleviate these issues. So obviously one of them is hire more Black women, faculty, staff, and administrators, but it doesn't stop there, because if you hire more Black women, faculty, staff, and administrators, but you still have these systemic barriers in place to their success, then that's not going to do anything about retention. You know, retention is an issue. Be clear about tenure requirements. a lot of times at institutions, tenure requirements are very vague. This is honestly the case at my institution. I had to talk to several different people to try to get an understanding of what the tenure requirements were. And it's even more difficult in my case because I work at a small liberal arts college where the promotion and tenure committee is comprised of people from a variety of disciplines. So the fine arts, the humanities, the social sciences, the sciences, and things like that. So everyone doesn't necessarily understand what I do as a sociologist, and therefore, whether or not they can actually like weigh in on the quality of my research and things like that, you know, is debatable. But that's what it is at my institution. So being clear about tenure requirements kind of levels the playing field, because that means that everyone knows this is what you need to do to get tenure. It's not a matter of, it's not arbitrary, it's not vague, you know, it just helps level the playing field. Review onboarding processes. So what's happening once these people are actually hired? How are they onboarded? What do those processes look like? Are there people who are actually helping them navigate the space? Because what tends to happen is once you get a job, people don't necessarily check in with you to see like how you're doing and, you know, what can I do to help make your experience better and things like that. And if you're moving to an area where you are very much underrepresented, it can be difficult to build a community there and things like that. All of those things matter when we're talking about retention. And then number 5, I said check in with Black women throughout their careers. So that goes back to what I just mentioned about people not necessarily checking in after someone gets hired in a position, and how that could be important in terms of retention. So making sure that things are going well, seeing what can be done to help them navigate these spaces and these positions. So I kind of wanted to make this interactive as well and ask you all what you think institutions of higher education can do to alleviate these issues. Do y'all have any ideas? It doesn't have to be like anything that you've like really thought about, but just, you know, maybe something from your personal experience. Provide support and mentoring structures. Yeah, that's huge. Yeah, that's absolutely huge. And also check in with how those are going, because those can be in place, but if no one's like monitoring it and there's no like real structure for it, then that can also not be, you know, the best thing. Mariko, I think that's right. Let me know if I pronounced that wrong.
You said it right.
Okay.
And implicating like if it's for first year or people who are just joining campus, courses specifically in diversity and inclusion, or making sure to a large section of those intro classes that everyone has to take, to make sure everyone is at least exposed to the ideas of microaggressions and everything like that. They at least have that.
Absolutely. That's really, really important. At my institution, my first year, I think it was, they made everyone, or they didn't make, I shouldn't say, it was highly encouraged for everyone to take or participate in these workshops on whiteness and things like that, which are good and helpful. But if it's not mandatory, like you said, then sometimes you end up preaching to the choir, right? People who already care about those issues. Anyone else?
I would say institutions having, I guess, a list of available sort of organizations or structures in place to support minoritized people. So for example, from a student perspective, right, on the College of Engineering website, knowing that if you are a woman in engineering, you might want to check out SWE. If you are a Black person in engineering, you may want to check out NSBE. And even sort of trickling that up to faculty and staff level. So some universities have like a Black Caucus, for example. So like that's available at the institution, making it known to say, hey, you may or may not be interested in this, but we wanted to let you know that this is available in case you are interested, so that you can engage in those mentoring and sort of fellowship opportunities. Because to your point of, if you're moving to a place where you may be underrepresented, maybe in terms of gender or race, or even just moving to a brand new place that you're not familiar with, allowing people to, or providing opportunities where people can establish genuine community, possibly even outside the confines of work, can really support people in the work that they're doing.
Agreed. Yeah. And going back to what you were saying about membership in various organizations and having things like a Black Caucus, that's really important. So like affinity groups, and then institutional memberships in things like NSBE, SWE, the National Center for Faculty Development and Diversity, and similar organizations. It says, one, that the institutions care about those issues, and then that they're trying to support their faculty who are in those positions. Let's see, I see a couple of other hands. Joe and then Ben.
Maybe one of the other ways, I think, at a sort of more cultural level would be to kind of broaden the sometimes narrow and limited ways that we think about contributions and performance and scholarship. So, you know, I sort of get tired of the institutions saying, oh, we want to support diversity, but it often goes in one of two ways. We outsource it to an admin position, or people can do it on their own times. And then when it comes time to, you know, annual reviews or tenure, the discussion is, okay, so, you know, that's all fine, but where your research dollars and your papers? So I think having a broader conception of different type of scholarship and sort of change that can be made in that area being a valuable contribution to the institution and to academia, I think would further a lot of these efforts a lot. And I think help sort of also diversify the way that we're thinking about what we're trying to achieve as a higher education institution.
Absolutely. Yeah. If we just have a very narrow idea of what a contribution is, that is not necessarily helpful for people who especially are called on to do a lot of extra service work, women and people of color. And this is even greater for people at like small institutions like where I work, where the infrastructure isn't great. So faculty are already carrying a heavy service load. Ben?
Yeah, in addition to that, and what you mentioned on the slide, Jennifer, I would say that we could use things that are metrics that are less subject to bias in the promotion process. For instance, in a previous meeting, we talked about how, you know, if a male faculty member and a female faculty member conduct class in identical ways, their reviews would be, student evaluations would be very different. And those evaluations are used for promotion, at least for the non-tenure track. And I assume the same spread exists in, you know, whites and minoritized groups. So having something that's less subject to bias could be helpful.
Absolutely. And I mean, yeah, that's so important. I should have included that in my slides, because the way that those evaluation surveys are written makes a huge difference. And a lot of times they're written in such a way that it's really easy for students to just give these really subjective responses. And it comes down to kind of a popularity contest in some ways, which isn't really fair. So yeah, absolutely evaluating that. Yeah, thank you all for sharing. Okay, and then finally, we're going to talk about what Black women in higher education can do to take care of themselves. So the first one I have here is practice self-care. This is a word that we hear about a lot. It has kind of become like a neoliberal thing or commodified, where companies are selling a lot of products that, you know, emphasize self-care, and there's a lot of like social media pages dedicated to it and things like that. Self-care doesn't have to be expensive. It doesn't have to be like anything luxurious, like, you know, an expensive yoga membership or massages or anything like that. The next thing I have on here is setting clear and firm boundaries, and that can be a form of self-care. So saying no, but that can also be difficult for women of color because we don't always feel like we can say no, especially if you're a junior faculty and you know, you don't have tenure yet. So you want to seem like a team player. You don't want to say no to everything. So you have to be really strategic about what you're saying yes to. And so that can be really difficult to navigate. I know from my personal experience, that's difficult to navigate. And there's been plenty of times when I've said yes to something because I want to be a team player, and then I end up regretting it because I'm overwhelmed. So that can be hard. Cultivate a strong support system. This can mean a lot of different things, and this can also be difficult depending on where you are. I know I have been able to cultivate this where I am currently, but everyone may not be able to. But it doesn't just have to be within your institution. It can be community-wide. It doesn't have to be people in your same position. So it doesn't have to be other faculty members. It can be staff. It can be administrators. Again, it can be people in the community, a therapist, friends. All of those things are really important. I'm very fortunate to have friends who are in similar positions to me, other Black women in higher education that we can talk to about these things, but not everyone has that. So, you know, it can be difficult, but again, it doesn't have to be within your institution itself. This is why going to conferences and things like that can be really helpful. I know Virginia Tech does a faculty women of color in the academy conference every year. And that I feel like is a really good space to meet other women of color in higher education and develop support systems through that, because it's not just academic, they also focus on mental health and wellness. Affirm themselves and their abilities. So like, it sounds kind of silly, but one of the things that I do and work on with my therapist is positive affirmations. So maybe making little post-its and putting them on your mirror, like, I am capable, I am worthy, I am smart, I belong here, you know, XYZ, to affirm yourself and looking at yourself in the mirror and saying those things, because imposter syndrome is real. Like I said, microaggressions and things like that don't make it any easier. But affirming yourselves and your abilities is one way to cope with this. And having other people do that, because other people do that. We just don't always believe them when they say things. But when you get an email from a student saying, you know, you're such an amazing professor, I'm so glad I took your class, or from a colleague saying, you know, thank you so much for XYZ, I'm really glad that, you know, you're my colleague, like, save those things, because when you're feeling, you know, your worst and not really being, you know, not really feeling very confident in your abilities, you can go back to those things and remind yourself, you know, this is who you are. And then finally, I have resist the strong Black woman trope. This is hard as well because it's so ingrained in us. So the strong Black woman trope is this idea that Black women are inherently strong, we can handle anything, you know, we're resilient. So like anything that's thrown at us, we can bounce back. And, you know, this is from a historical place of like Black women being able to overcome a lot of things. But at the same time, a lot of times this becomes a way for Black women to not take care of ourselves because we place so much emphasis on being strong for everyone else and not always putting ourselves first. And so it's just really important to remind ourselves that we need to do that. And I realize that these things are very much individual. So we have to have the connection between those individual things and the structural things in order to, and really it's the onus of responsibility is on the institutions to make academic spaces more equitable. But while we're navigating these institutions, we can practice some of these things so that it helps us and helps to alleviate stress. Oh, also, I should have mentioned as a form of self-care, taking time off for rest, because that's really important. There's so much pressure to work. I know I always feel that, most academics and people in higher education, I feel like feel that, but taking time off is really important. So next week, many of us have a full week for Thanksgiving, or even if we don't, like a few days, really taking that time to rest and recharge and focus on yourself.